Económicas y Matemáticas de Capital University. Su maestría y doctorado en Economía lo obtuvo en West Virginia University, Estados Unidos. Fue investigadora asociada postdoctoral en el Free Market Institute de Texas Tech University y también sirvió como docente investigadora en el Free Market Roadshow de Europa. Sus campos principales de investigación son el análisis de las instituciones y la economía pública. Ella explora las determinantes de la libertad económica y el rol de la globalización en la evolución de las instituciones económicas. Sus artículos se han publicado en journals de alta calidad, como Contemporary Economic Policy y el European Journal of Political Economy. Ella es también un Fellow Senior en Fraser Institute. Actualmente, la doctora Kathleen Sheehan es docente investigadora en el Hayter College of Business de Creighton, Universidad, Estados Unidos. Hoy nos muestra los resultados de su investigación y sobre los derechos de propiedad de las mujeres y el crecimiento económico. Kathleen, now you can begin your presentation.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you so much for having me today. So I would like to kind of begin to explore the idea of how women's property rights can matter for economic growth. And so part of this idea begins with some of the really large inequality that there exists between economic growth. So in women's rights. So in 90% of countries, there is at least one legal barrier to women fully participating in the economic marketplace. And so I think it's reasonable to assume that this will have impacts on economic growth. I want to start with the idea that property rights are really important for a country to experience economic growth and development. And so, there's this famous paper that goes through and talks about how institutions rule. Institutions that protect private property are going to be a determinant of the economic growth of that country. There's kind of a long literature that goes through and looks at this. And the strong property rights themselves, so specifically looking at property rights and how they relate to the economic institutions, are associated with higher income levels in countries. Okay, and so what this map is it's a map of the world tied to the country's economic freedom level. And so economic freedom in this case includes more than just property rights, but it's largely seen to be a belief that people can go through and participate in the marketplace without the government standing in the way, but the government having enough rules and regulations in place to allow for that marketplace interaction. So this is a map of the world with these property rights in place, these economic institutions, and we can kind of see how it correlates pretty highly with our understanding of economic growth and development within these countries too. Countries that have more economic freedom, more ability to go into the marketplace and buy and sell and trade goods, start new businesses, have higher levels of economic development and higher levels of economic growth than countries that don't have economic freedom. This has largely been kind of the narrative in the economic growth space for maybe the last 2 decades, really kind of going in and digging into this idea of economic freedom being important for development. And we can kind of see like some of the international organizations really highlighting and digging into this idea too, putting it into terms of loans and grants, trying to promote it in some ways to differing degrees of effectiveness and everything. But this has really been the narrative. However, if we go through and we look at what the research is based on, if we go through and we look at the data that's being used for this, this is largely assuming that everyone within the country has equal protection under the law. And we just kind of know that that is not actually the case or the scenario that most people in most countries are facing. So the rules actually differ pretty considerably within any given country. So institutions do not afford uniform protection of property rights. And so the basis of our research is starting off with the idea that at least 50% of the population in many countries do not have the same protections. Now, currently, in the research that we're doing, we're specifically looking at gender property rights. And so men's rights versus women's rights. We're not including or analyzing other areas in which uniform protection of property rights might not exist. For example, with minority groups within a country, that is kind of outside of the scope of what I'm looking at within my specific research question. Okay, and so I thought it would be helpful to go through and kind of think about some of the different restrictions that women are facing across the world. So in 86 countries, women face some sort of job restriction. Type of job restriction might be the hours that you are allowed to legally work within your country. If you need your husband's permission to go through and get a job, if you are allowed to participate in all forms of jobs within the country, or if you're relegated to certain industries or kept from certain industries. In many countries, for example, you're not allowed to work in construction jobs if you're a woman, or you can't work after like 8 p.m. in some countries. Worldwide, the labor force participation rate is around 80% for men and around 50% for women. And so I think this is kind of important to highlight. It's not necessary that we would ever expect the labor force partition rates to be equal, but having these legal barriers in place are keeping women from entering the workforce, which is going to have long-term economic growth impacts for our country as well. So there is some new set of research coming out of the IMF that's really starting to study gender rights and their impacts. And there's a new paper out that goes through and it looks at the impact of equal laws and how that matters for different countries. And just the presence of these equal laws, of course, is boosting labor force participation rate. Right? That's fully expected, but it's still an important result to be able to go through and highlight. They find really strong results within their paper. In fact, that just changing a few of the laws can boost that labor force participation rate by 5%. Within that research, they link it really closely to inequality. So Austria and Berg in their paper are going through and highlighting kind of how hard it is to use redistribution within a country to help with economic inequality. And linking these two papers together, Gonzalez kind of goes through and says that one way that a country could help its economic inequality would be to boost labor force participation rate. Boosting labor force participation rate can go through and happen through making these laws more equal over time too. Okay, and so I thought it'd be helpful to highlight a few areas where some of these property rights are unequal. So we have, they're unequal in terms of the jobs that you can get. That's definitely going to impact labor force participation. But we also get like variations in like the financial markets and what a woman has access to. This is going to be important for going through and thinking about opening a business. It can be important for thinking about how you would even just invest in your own individual home, which could have large impacts on children as well within the home and country. I want to kind of highlight that it's not always super unequal. So like looking at the overall large data statistics can make it think that there are huge inequalities, and there are in many places, but often there may be less unequal than we would initially think too. So this particular measure is from the World Bank, and it's whether a woman can open a bank account in the same way as a man. At least through the formal rules, this data, which is in 2020 data, goes through and says that yes, women in most countries can open a bank account the same way as men. Now note that this might not be the experience everyone within the country is facing, and it might be that it varies within a country too. So maybe in some areas you can, in some areas you can't. Both a strength and a limitation of the research that my colleague Colin O'Reilly and I are engaging in is that we are focused on the formal rules within the country. We are not taking into account the informal rules of the country. And so this one creates a little bit more, there is more inequality in this one. Female and male surviving spouses have equal rights to inherit assets, right? This one definitely differs in certain parts of the country. And so you could certainly think how this would have large implications for going through and thinking about how you would invest in your children, kind of the long-term planning that you would make within the household as well. The law grants spouses equal administrative authority over assets during the marriage, right? So in many cases, we go through and we look at laws, and before marriage, women have more rights than once they are married, and some of those rights disappear. And of course, that would impact behavior within the household as well. Okay. And so within this, formal legal restrictions in many countries prevent women from owning property, engaging in voluntary trade and operating businesses. So this is going to reduce effects of entrepreneurship. It would impact investment in women in and of itself. So I would fully expect that in countries where there are not equal laws, that you would also see, and we do in fact see in the data, that you have an underinvestment in women in terms of education throughout their livelihood as well. So within the data that I'm specifically looking at for my analysis, things that we kind of see popping up. In 24 of the countries, women are not allowed to work 19 hours. In 19 countries, women need their husband's permission in order to work at all. So past research that has gone through and studied this, there is some research that shows that there's a negative correlation between the lack of rights for women and GDP per capita. So this isn't really going through and not necessarily looking at a causal mechanism, but rather it's just showing that this is there. Notice this is also in 2009. And so the paper itself is before a lot of the recent kind of change in the collection of data for the differing between men's rights and women's rights begins to happen. This Lawson-Raymer paper is very interesting because while most of the research is similar to mine and specifically is looking at gender issues, in her paper, she actually looks at non-elites, so some minorities and within different countries as well, and shows that the property and security of non-elites can be associated with economic growth, but also associated with conflict itself. So the paper is very nuanced. It shows that in some cases it can allow for economic growth, but in many cases, it leads to additional conflict in the country and long-term slowdown in growth there. Okay. And so from kind of that understanding, there's a new strain of literature kind of going through and looking at women's empowerment and growth. And so in 2012, Duflo has this really nice paper where she goes through and looks at how women's empowerment influences economic development. And she goes through and she kind of navigates all of the different channels that this might happen through. So the one that we're specifically looking at for this paper is the human capital aspect of it. So if women are not empowered, if women don't have the same rights as men, we wouldn't expect as much of an emphasis on developing that human capital. Because we're underdeveloping that human capital, we should expect that will have implications for the growth and development of the country as well. And then, there's some other research just showing that there's a large association between gender equality and growth. So again, there are questions of causality here, but countries that have greater levels of gender inequality have lower growth rates. As countries become more equal in what their laws are, they have higher levels of growth rate as well. Okay, and so from this, we are starting to develop a research question where we're going through and we're thinking about how the unequal protection of property rights for women are impacting the overall economic growth of the country. And again, I want to highlight that we're specifically thinking about the formal rules within that country place. We're not considering the economic culture within the place and any type of economic any type of informal rules that might also stand in the way of women participating in the marketplace. And so in the first piece of research that my co-author and I go through, what we find is that women's property rights are significantly associated with economic growth, even when we control for the effect of men's rights. And so I want to take a minute to kind of go through and think about what this is doing. So we find that women's rights are really important for economic growth. This ties to some of the other literature that we see in this area as well. In that women's rights are important for schooling. Women's rights are important for movement from rural areas into the city, which would have impacts on entrepreneurship. And even if we control for the rights of men, so thinking of that map at the beginning, where we know that property rights for men are tied to economic growth. Even when we control for that, the women's property rights are really important. This ties into some of the kind of the research that's done on what happens if we give entrepreneurship loans to women versus men, or if we try and favor them there as well. So this result is very strong there, and that this association is larger and more robust than for men. So there's a small limitation in this, in that you can have poor rights and poor growth. There's nothing in the data that says that women ever have more rights than men, right? There's no country where that's happening. And so if we just kind of go through on that extensive margin and improve women's property rights, get them more up equal to men, we can see large kind of growth outcomes for that, even if we haven't improved the overall property rights within the country itself. And so in some ways that this might be potentially easier if a constitution's already in place that's allowing for some of those property rights. We just have to go through and make those more equal. We don't have to improve them overall. And of course, if we went through and improved the property rights at the country for both men and women, we would expect that to tie to greater levels of economic growth as well. So the institutional improvements on the extensive margin can have a particularly large effect on economic growth within that country. Okay. I wanted to go through and think about some of the other rules maybe that are impacting. So the initial research that we did uses the varieties of democracy data itself, and it goes through it, and it's nice in that it highlights men versus women's rights. It kind of excludes some things. And so one measure that we do see a huge amount of variation within is whether women can go through and sign a contract in the same way as men, right? And so there are many, many countries within the world where women cannot sign a contract in the same way that men can. And we would expect then that this would have really large implications for women's labor force participation rate. It would have implications for businesses. And so this could be particularly stark and maybe an easy change that countries could make, even at and have important implications for all levels of development. So one thing that's really interesting, if we go through and we look at women's labor force participation rate, it has kind of this U shape to it. So when countries are very poor, women participate in the marketplace. They go out and they work largely because they have to. As countries start to have a little bit of economic development, we see women step back from that labor force. And then when you get to higher levels of economic development, they enter into that marketplace as well. This research has always been done at the country level itself, but you could see how this might be really important within a country, and go through and think about how extending the right to a contract could help kind of all levels of development within that country, and it again be helpful for going through and thinking about the economic inequality that might be present within a country place. Okay, so we started with the research question of how does the unequal protection of property rights for women impact economic growth? We find that when women property rights, that they see higher levels of growth, improving property rights for women to go up to match the men and see growth within the country, or if you improved both women's and men's property rights, you would see higher levels of growth. And kind of our next research question, and the one that I'll talk about more today, is we wanted to go through and think about how that process is working. What aspects of economic growth are being specifically impacted by women having more property rights? And so we're going to go through and do this by looking at the factors of production for the protection of property rights. Okay, and so kind of for the researchers here in the audience with me, what we're going to do is we're just starting with a kind of standard growth regression where we're using GDP growth rates and then property rights, and then the change of property rights within that growth rate itself. because we want to go through and think about the factors of production specifically, the factors of production here are going to be economic growth is impacted largely by the natural resources of a country, the labor, so the human capital and labor share within the country, and then the capital within the country, which is often represented within these growth regressions as investment, and then some type of air term that we can't easily quantify being about like technology advancement. And so specifically what we're looking at is how are property rights important for the investment and the human capital within the country place. And so this one is a little bit different than our first paper in that we're looking at a gender disparity data. So the first paper says, here's the rights for men, here's the rights for women. What we're doing within this paper instead is we are using the Fraser Index's economic freedom of the world data. They've gone through and they have tried to improve their overall measure by taking into account women's property rights as well. And they're specifically doing this in Area 2, and they're adjusting what the legal system and property rights component is. So kind of two things with this. I'd like to first say that I am a senior fellow for the Fraser Institute. So I don't actually collect the data or anything for it, but I am facilitated with the group that makes this data. And then I'd like to go through and we have kind of taken the data out of their analysis to create some type of like inequality index so we can compare how the having rights that are unequal are impacting factors of development within that country. And so countries with higher economic freedom are also more likely to have higher equality and rights as well. So this inequality index is highly correlated in terms of the growth. As countries get more property rights overall, they also make their property rights more equal within that. And so the gender disparity index itself is created from the World Bank's report on women, business, and the law. And so the World Bank is written laws and regulations for each country. They're very careful to do a de jure measure of what's happening within that country, not the de facto, which is why my colleague and I would like to use this. We would like to look at the formal rules. In future papers, I hope to go through and kind of think about culture impacts as well. The reason that we're initially thinking about de jure measures of the law here is we think that if anything, it will cause our results to be smaller. So in the first paper where we went through and we looked at the impact of economic growth, even if we're finding pretty strong results where it's just the formal rule in place. So even if the culture is at odds with what the Constitution or those law changes are saying, we're still seeing that they have some type of impact. So if anything, our magnitudes are smaller than they would be if we were also controlling for culture within the country. Within this gender disparity index that we're using, the legal and regulatory barriers that we're searching for are looking at women's ability to move throughout the country, contract with freedom, having certain levels of business freedom, so the ability to sell their business, to take out loans, financial rights, the freedom to work, property rights in general. Are you allowed to own property? Do you need a father or husband's permission for that property right? And then just kind of the legal status. So some of this would be, are you able to get a passport within the country? How are you recognized before the law if you have like a court case in place? So this is a really messy graph. So I both apologize and I think it's important to look at. So within this graph, we can see that rights are getting a lot more equal. So in this 50-year time period, there were many countries that were completely unequal in 1970 that are much, much more equal today. So if you look at South Africa, for example, they have a score of a 0 on this gender adjustment. Women really did not have economic property rights within the country in 1970. In 1990, they go through and they change all of those laws and they become, I think, like a 0.8 up to a 1 in some cases by giving those rights to women. We can see that a lot of countries go through and create this. The Caribbean and Latin America are some of the countries that have done the most changes in their rules to create this to create this equality. It's largely men in countries right now that have large areas of disparity. However, we still see plenty of rules in place where this disparity is present. Kind of for the researchers here and with us, for our control variables, we're using world development indicators and kind of standard measures for economic growth, where we're controlling for real GDP per capita, the population, the percent of the population that's urban. In different regressions, we are controlling for oil as a measure of natural resources within the country, which is kind of standard within the literature. Gross capital formation, primary and secondary education. If we go through, and not presented here, but we have results where we've gone through and we've controlled for religion, and it doesn't change our results in any significant way if we do that. And then we're using the Penn World Table data for our capital stock and our human capital in order to really be able to narrow in on those factors of production. And so our summary statistics, just kind of the number of countries that we're able to look at from 1970 to 2015. Okay, and so within this, we have done kind of three major measures. We've done a large cross-section where we just kind of make all of the countries equal across time. We've done a pooled panel and then a fixed effect panel. And we can go through and we can see that property rights are important for the economic growth of a country. This aligns very closely with what we tend to see in the literature, and that inequality within those property rights is having a negative impact on the growth rate of the country. So the more unequal the property rights are between men and women, the more the lower economic growth rate that the country is seeing. When we go through and we break this apart by the factors of production, what we go through and we end up seeing is that the investment is important, but human capital has a larger impact. So if we go through and we look specifically at the marginal effect of investment on GDP, we can go through and see that so additional investment per GDP is, if there's equal protection, we expect it to have like a 1.2% impact on growth. For countries with very unequal levels of property right protection, so like an inequality of a value of 3, the effect of investment on growth drops down to 0.88%. So this is a small drop. It's a reduction in the growth rate by about 1/3. However, if you think of kind of how growth rates grow on each other and the rule of 70, a drop of 1/3 is going to be significant in the long run. And again, we would expect this result to be smaller than if we were also including the impacts of culture within this. Human capital really is where we're seeing the stronger result. So if there is equality within the country, men and women have the same rights, we tend to see that human capital has a 2% impact on economic growth and development. If we have inequality about the 2 level, so if it's on a 10-point index, if we go from having completely equal at a 10 down to unequal at an 8, that drops the growth rate down to a 1.1%, which again it's going to be about a 1% impact on the economic growth of a country, which over time would be pretty large and have long-term implications for how that country grows within it. This also, to me, is a result that aligns closely with past literature, which makes me have some faith in our data and our results here. A lot of the literature really highlights how it's human capital that's impacted by these unequal property rights, and how human capital, women really invest in that as they get additional property rights themselves. Okay, so accounting for the protection of property. So if we go through and we kind of look at this, immediate things that countries could kind of do to help that would be very low cost. The World Bank reports that only 24% of available gender-specific indicators have data available from the last 10 years. So this seems like something that countries could do very easily being a relative term, that could have large impacts. So just collecting the data better, reporting the data, I know that this is a little bit loaded. For example, the IMF in July this year just announced that they're going to start considering gender rights in some of their allocations. I know that's going to have big impacts, and of course that can get messy with the economic incentives of reporting actors there as well, but just the improvement of data collection and data reporting could do a lot to make changes within this space. And then in terms of, going through and looking at some of these differences, one that's very stark to me is whether women can sign a contract in the same way as men. This would have, it'd be reasonable to assume that this would have very large impacts on entrepreneurship. It would have large impacts on labor force participation, in engaging in long-term contracts for employment versus maybe an hourly style of contract. So going through and thinking about kind of what rules and laws are in place within a country in regards to contracts might have a really large impact on that labor force participation rate and that investment in human capital that we see within that country. So thank you very much for your time today. I look forward to your questions. If you have any kind of suggestions on the econometrics or anything within the paper, please feel free to email me. I would love to kind of see you there as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kathleen, for such a great thought-provoking presentation. I have a few questions. Number one, in your research, did you find any case of a country where women's property rights were achieved before men's property rights?
No. So we have kind of varying degrees of property rights from 4 different data sources, and in none of those data sources do women have more rights than men.
Okay, thank you. I have another question here. It says, this is a very interesting approximation to the problem. Maybe it would be good to put a variable in your model that contains how can I say, how long the application of respect for women's property rights has taken. A rich country that is just beginning to respect these rights is not the same as a poor country that has a long tradition of respecting women's rights.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. Thank you very much. I think that would really help with some of like the robustness checks within there too. And I think it would also help us go through and kind of look at the impact of the investment that people are making within their children. So thank you for that comment. I will certainly go through and do that with the econometrics.
You're welcome. And according to your experience and the literature that you have reviewed, perhaps in countries like China, they have a special economic system. Could this research among their provinces give interesting results since there are freer territories than others in China?
Oh, so doing it like at the province level there?
Yes. Yes. If what do you think about, from the literature that you have reviewed? How different would it be? Like China has a special economic system, and if you perform, or if there is a research that performs, some investigation about their provinces, the results maybe would be different comparing with freer territories. What do you think from your review that you have made?
Yeah, so I guess what I've kind of seen done in the research is so our research right now is a little unusual because we're trying to consider all countries at once. A lot of the research on development for women's property rights is very country specific. So India is the one that I've seen kind of the most on. They'll go through and they'll look at a law change within India and kind of look at, the implications across India. I haven't seen the equivalent done for China. Within the United States, women's property rights, of course, changed at the federal level at one time through an amendment to the Constitution, but states had very different protections for women's rights across time. And for example, like North Dakota, which is a fairly small, well, space-wise, it's a large country, but population-wise, it's very small. They used the improvement in women's property rights as an incentive for women to move to the state so that they could get statehood. And you do see that as they improved women's property rights, women were more likely to move there. And then you can kind of see that impact on their economic growth. I don't know how that would kind of tie to China, but I think it's an interesting question. Part of it would be if you could get data at the province level there. But.
Right. Yes, that could be an issue, right? All right. And in your opinion, what are the trends of this type of research line?
Yeah, the trends are, I think, very, very interesting and very hopeful. So two kind of trends. We see in 1970, we saw very unequal rights. In 1990, we tended to see a huge jump in what the rights are for women. A lot of that was Latin America going through and making large changes there in the Caribbean as well. Where we really see very large differences in rights anymore would be in kind of the Middle East and North Africa there. And so in that case, the trend is very hopeful. We see rights, certainly 90% of countries still have some rule in place that makes it a bit unequal. And then if we look at kind of people taking into account this research, it's really within the last 5 years that we've seen a huge jump. The World Bank has gone through and they've started collecting data on it and more. They've put a large amount of resources into creating this data set and advertising it. If you log onto their website, the graphs are very pretty to go through and look at. And in July of this past summer, the IMF just said that they're going to start considering it for their loans. So I know that will end up sparking a ton of research within it. And then at the academic level, I've seen, I'm going to a conference this summer, which is about 20 papers kind of working on these issues. So if you look at past literature review, it's kind of light, but I think there will be a lot more within the next 5 years in it.
Great. And what were some of the constraints that you faced while you were doing this study?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the constraints are somewhat data specific. Whether you can go through and actually reliably separate it out is kind of a concern. And then in terms of things that I'm interested in improving with the paper on, or maybe not the paper, but doing an additional paper for, is this difference between informal rules and formal rules, or de facto and de jure rules, is going to be really important. We've seen other research on this. Just because you change your constitution or your rules in place, of course, does not mean that you change the culture of a country. And so I think it would be important to go through and kind of think about where are there differences there, where has there been a formal rule change, but we don't actually see it on the ground taking place, and then going through and thinking about kind of the impacts of that. Is the formal rule enough there? What is it that causes culture to change kind of within that place as well?
Okay, whenever we perform a research, there at the end, we usually it raises, questions and possible lines or things that were not taken into consideration. What would you say about this regarding your study?
Yeah, so I think the role of culture is the biggest thing that we're completely lacking within our research and our paper. And then, of course, I think the divide of rural versus cities might matter quite a bit here. And then what countries are dropping out of our analysis. So we do like a completely balanced panel, and then we allow for unbalanced. And some of these measures that we know are important are not collected every year, every 5 years. And so some of the countries probably that are most important for the analysis tend to come in and out of it. And so, we try different econometric techniques to account for that. But it's certainly important and something that we're not fully capturing there.
Okay, so these are the questions that, I don't know, Fabricio, maybe you have any other comment. Thank you so much, Kathleen, for
Thank you very much.